Hello everyone, welcome back. We've been talking about blood vessels, and in our last video we were looking into detail at the structure of arteries and the function of arteries, as well as how the structure of arteries fits their function. Now before we move on to veins and capillaries, I would like you to take a moment to read your textbook and to find out the answers to these two questions. What happens when the muscles in the wall of the artery contract or relax? And also, do all arteries carry oxygenated blood? Alright, so have a read and continuing on with the video once you're done. Okay, we're going to move on now to veins. Now these are some microscope images of the cross-section of veins. Now if you've forgotten what a cross-section is, if this was a vein and the blood flows through the vein this way, then the cross-section is if you took the vein and you cut it down this way. Right, and you looked at it this way, then you would see the cross-section of the vein. Now if you compare the cross-section of the vein to the cross-section of the artery that we saw earlier, you would spot some immediate differences. Do you see the difference? Well, one of the big differences is that the lumen in the vein is much larger. And we're going to look at some of the differences in the next coming few slides as well. Alright, but first, let's label the cross-section of the vein. Now the names of the different layers in the vein are exactly the same as the names of the different layers in the arteries. Okay, so the outermost layer, the connective tissue, right? Then inside the connective tissue we have the elastic fibers and the smooth muscle. Okay, and then the one cell thick layer here is called the endothelium, and the space where the blood flows through called the lumen. Once again, lumen, not hole. Okay? So what's the function of veins? Well, if we recall from earlier, veins transport blood back to the heart. And usually this is at a much lower blood pressure. So compare this to the arteries. Arteries transport blood away from the heart, usually at a very high pressure. So here's my heart, and here's my artery. It transports blood away from the heart at a very high pressure, right? Because it's very near to the heart. Once blood moves out of the heart, pumps, then it comes out at a very high pressure, and it moves into the arteries, and then into the arterioles, and then into the capillaries, and then into the venules, and then into the veins, which transport blood back to the heart. Now by the time it reaches the veins, the blood has traveled a very great distance. It has lost a lot of energy. So blood is at a very low pressure once it's inside the veins. Now this creates some problems. Imagine if your veins had to carry blood up, back to your heart, from the bottom of your leg. It would be a very difficult task because there is gravity acting against that, right? And it's very hard to transport blood upwards at a low pressure. So that results in problems in some people. You might have seen this condition before. Some very weird looking things on their legs. This condition is called varicose veins. Alright, it happens when the veins become enlarged because blood isn't pumped up the leg back to the heart properly. So it starts to accumulate inside the blood vessels. Alright, so key point, veins transport blood back to the heart at a lower pressure. So let's ask the question now. Veins transport blood at a lower pressure. So how are they adapted for that function? Well, firstly, veins tend to have thinner muscular and elastic layers compared to the arteries. So remember, this is our artery here in a very thick muscle and elastic layer. But in our vein, the muscle and elastic layer is a lot thinner. And that's because the blood pressure is much lower in the vein and the blood flows more slowly. So there's no need for a thick muscular wall to withstand high pressure. And the second thing is that veins tend to have a larger lumen, a larger space for blood to flow through. Now this is to minimize the resistance for blood flow. Because the blood is already at very low pressure, you need a lower resistance for the blood flow. Now this next point is really important, so listen up. One way that veins are adapted is that they have structures called valves. Now valves are very simply two flaps of tissue. So one flap of tissue here and one flap of tissue here. And they look kind of crescent shape. So these valves are called semilunar valves. Now valves allow blood to flow in one direction but not in the other direction. So imagine that this is a vein. Imagine the bottom is the bottom of your foot, the bottom of your leg, and here is towards the heart. Toward heart. Alright, so blood is being pumped upwards back to the heart. Now the valve allows blood to be pumped from the leg upward, but if the blood is very slow and it tries to slip back down, the valve closes. It does not allow the blood to flow back in this direction. So the valve, we say that the valve prevents the backflow of blood. And this is very important in veins because blood is at a very low pressure. Without the valves, blood might actually flow backwards. Alright, so we say that veins contain semilunar valves which prevent the backflow of blood. This video shows a very simple animation of that. You can see that the valve allows blood to flow in this direction, but it doesn't allow blood to come backwards down. Okay, so that's the valve preventing backflow of blood. Now, beside valves, veins also work together with skeletal muscle to pump blood back to the heart. Okay, so veins are surrounded by skeletal muscle, and the contraction of muscles helps blood to flow back up. So here in this video, you'll see these two pieces of flesh here. These are your muscles. Imagine that they're muscles in your legs. And as you move around and your muscles contract, it actually helps the blood to flow upwards too. So have a look at this short video.
Veins contain one-way valves that work in conjunction with skeletal muscles. When the skeletal muscles contract, the valves open, and blood is forced toward the heart. When the skeletal muscles relax, the valves close to prevent the backflow of blood away from the heart.
Alright, so hopefully that helps to clarify things. Alright, let's take a deep breath and just a few seconds of rest before we move on to our final blood vessel, which is the capillary. So here are three microscope images of the cross-section of capillaries. And what you might immediately notice is that capillaries don't really have different layers. So look at this image here. You see the lumen of the capillary. I'll highlight the lumen, okay, the space where the blood flows through. And the capillary wall seems to be just made out of one cell. Right? It's a very strange looking cell. Okay, and here's the nucleus of the cell. Right, and the cell kind of forms this shape where it wraps around. Yeah, I'm highlighting the cell membrane. It wraps around to form a tube. And that is how the capillary is formed. It's just made out of one cell. Right, one cell along the length of the capillary. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So here's our capillary and a diagram of it. Let's label it. Okay, here is the wall of the capillary. We call it the endothelium, and it's only one cell thick. Okay, and here of course is the lumen of the capillary. So capillaries are made up of a single layer of cells called the endothelium. Now this endothelium is partially permeable. Okay, so it allows substances to diffuse through the capillary wall. So substances can diffuse out of the capillary and diffuse into the capillary. And that's really important because the function of capillaries, if you recall, is to exchange substances with the body cells. Okay, let's look more at. Okay, so what's the function of capillaries? Well, they allow the exchange of substances between blood and tissue cells. So here's a diagram of it. Here's our artery. It branches out into arterioles, and the arterioles branch out into capillaries. Now, notice that in this region, the capillaries are weaving themselves or passing through among the tissue cells. And the tissue cells are these yellow objects behind in the background of the capillaries. So the tissue cells are able to then exchange substances with the capillaries before the capillaries join back into the venule and to the vein. Here's a second diagram of that. Here's my capillary. You can see the red blood cells moving through. you can see that the capillary is only 1 cell thick, right? 1 cell thick. And you can see that here are my tissue cells. Okay, here's my tissue cells. So the tissue cells are very close to the capillaries, and it allows substances to be exchanged. So substances can move from the tissue cell into the capillary, and from the capillary into the tissue cell. Right, let's look at that more in detail. Okay, so how are capillaries adapted for their function? Well, firstly, capillaries are highly branched, so that allows a large surface area for exchange of substances with the tissue cells. Secondly, the blood in capillaries flow very slowly, and that allows more time for substances to be exchanged between the capillaries and the tissue cells. Finally, capillaries have an endothelium that is 1 cell thick, or capillary walls are 1 cell thick, and that allows for very quick rate of diffusion out of the capillaries and into the capillaries, thus helping the function of capillaries to exchange substances with tissue cells. So let's have a closer look at how substances are exchanged between capillaries and tissue cells. So in my diagram here, again you see the capillary and you see the tissue cells. Right? So the important thing to note is that tissue cells are surrounded by a colorless solution called tissue fluid. So this region here is entirely filled with tissue fluid. Alright? This is the tissue fluid. Now, useful substances like oxygen and nutrients move from the blood capillaries into the tissue fluid and then into the tissue cells by diffusion. Right? So useful substances diffuse from the blood capillaries out through the endothelium into the tissue fluid and then into the tissue cells by diffusion. So what about waste products? Well, waste products, for example, carbon dioxide, tend to move from the tissue cells because the tissue cells produce a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide will move from the tissue cells into the tissue fluid, across the endothelium, into the blood capillaries, again by diffusion. Okay, so waste substances from the tissue cells into tissue fluid, across the endothelium, into the blood capillaries by diffusion. Alright, I'm going to stop here, and in our final video, we'll look at this final question of how is the tissue fluid formed. Right, the tissue fluid is the fluid that surrounds the tissue cells. How is it formed? Alright, so stay tuned for that.